Good afternoon and welcome to the American University Museum at the Castle Center. This is our 18th expedition of Gail Rebhan. She's, Gail is a DC-based photographer and professor emerita of photography at Northern Virginia Community College. She has an MFA from the California Institute of the Arts and an undergraduate degree from Antioch College. Integral to her various bodies of work is an interest in time and change. Her works, which often configure photographs and text in series, examine gender, aging, race, ethnicity, and the built environment. We first worked together when you were doing a photo collage examining the cultural history and present of Tenleytown. So I was very interested in what she was looking at in our neighborhood. And so when we were later approached by the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition trying to do an exhibition that examined life in Washington, sort of now and in the past, and I knew how to do it. I just called Gail because she's done really beautiful work on this. Her self-portraits titled "Living" examine the taboo subject of female aging. In her recent work, "What Questions Do We Ask?" uses shifting U.S. Census questions to create a visual synopsis of U.S. history. Very appropriate on the 250th birthday of our president. We got to hold your first museum retrospective at the American University Museum, and the book that you published from that exhibition, Gail Rebhan, About Time, won all kinds of awards, and it's a really beautiful catalog. If you get a chance to take a look at it. And her show travels to the California Museum of Photography in Riverside, California. Rebhan photographs and coordinates exhibitions with the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition. We've done 2 of those exhibitions here. It's always a great pleasure to work with you. We are joined today by Rumsha Palowska. MJ Rumsha Palowska. I apologize. She's an interdisciplinary cultural historian of the 19th and 20th century in the United States and an associate professor here at the American University of History and Public History. She's the author of History Comes Alive, History and Popular Culture in the 1970s, published by the University of North Carolina Press, which traces the emergence of immersive engagement with the past in post-war American culture and numerous articles in scholarly journals. She's on the board of directors of Humanities DC and advisory boards, the DC History Center and the Humanities Trust. Serves as series editor for the National Park Service and National Council on Public History's 2021-2025 American Revolution 250th Commemoration of Scholars Forums. She's just the perfect place to have a discussion with about Gail Rebhan's new work. And with this, should I invite Gail?
It quotes verbatim on the U.S. Census, from the questions on the U.S. Census starting from 1790 to 2020. And to me, it's fascinating the way the terminology changes, the assumptions that are in the question, people who are not historians are used to looking at these documents as if they're neutral documents, but they all have biases in them, and they reflect the era in which they were made. I use the American flag motif to emphasize that these are government documents, these are American questions, this is from an American point of view. And the background is census forms from different eras. So the early ones have beautiful handwriting on them, and then they become these really boring government forms. Some people have asked me, why do this as visual art and not as a research paper? And for one thing, I think it makes it a lot more accessible to view it as visual art. I would read a research paper about census questions, but I think most people would be turned off by the topic. But when it's visual, I think it's just a lot more accessible, and a lot of people will look at it. And the idea is to raise questions, to make people think about it and make their own connections. So I arranged them by topic. So one is disability, race, getting to work, technology, and then it's chronological. And I picked the years that I thought the question changed very dramatically, that indicated a change in the culture. So I wanted to just talk about two of them. It's 1850 census. It says, is the person deaf, dumb, blind, insane, idiotic, pauper, or convict? Which are all these terminologies that we would not use today. And then it says slave, deaf, dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. So there's so much in this question. First of all, it separates people from slaves as if they're not human beings. And then it doesn't ask them if they're pauper or convict. Right, because they are paupers and they have the same rights as a convict. In 1860, it asks, does this person have a physical, mental, or other health condition which has lasted 6 or more months and which limits the kind or amount of work this person can do, prevents this person from working at a job, limits or prevents this person from using public transportation. So it becomes much more functional and not using these kind of labels. And the labels also, I think, imply that it's really permanent. In 2020, which is the last census, it says, is this person deaf, or does he, she have difficulty hearing? Is this person blind, or does she, he have serious difficulty seeing even when wearing glasses? Because of a physical, mental, or emotional condition, does this person have serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions? And then does this person have serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs? Does this person have difficulty dressing or bathing? Because of a physical, mental, or emotional condition, does this person have difficulty doing errands alone, such as visiting a doctor's office or shopping? And I feel like in the 2020 census, if people live long enough, everybody towards the end of life is going to be in this disability category. The other one that I just wanted to highlight is the one on race, and it's really interesting how that one has changed over time. So in 1790, it just asks number of white males under 16 years of age, number of white males over 16 years of age, number of white females, number, and then it says number of free persons and number of slaves. Then in 1860, it has W for whites, B for blacks, M for mulattoes. In 1870, it expands to W for white, B for black, M for mulatto, C for Chinese, and they have in parentheses a category which includes all East Asians, and I for American Indian. And then it expands a little in 1930, which was W for white, NEG for black, MEX for Mexican, IN for American Indian, CH for Chinese, JP for Japanese, FIL for Filipino, HIN for Hindu, KOR for Korean, all other races to be written out in full. And then in 2020 is the first year where people could check more than one box. And it's expanded a great deal. And it's the first time for white it asks more detail, like German, Irish, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian. And it also goes into more detail for black, says African American, Jamaican, Haitian. I'm not going to read all of them. And same for American Indian, it lists a bunch of different tribes. So it's interesting how our definition of race changes over time. So this is just one of them. Some of them are more humorous, like one of them is getting to work, which wasn't asked until 1960. This work is a continuation really of my own work, and although formally it looks different, of dealing with American society and how our values change over time, and emphasizing that the past influences the present, and not erasing the past, that we should know what our past is and what our past values are. There's a QR code that'll appear on the screen and is also outside. It'd be really cool if you guys could use that. It would link to my website, and you could ask your own census questions, which will be posted. And it'll just have your first name, and you don't even want your real first name, you can put whatever first name you want on there. But I think it would be really interesting to see what topics people are interested in. And so all of my work deals with time and change and how it reflects our various values.
So I'm I'm delighted that Gail asked me to come and say some words about the historical context of this work. It's really been a pleasure thinking about it. So as a word of explanation, I am not a historian of the census. I am not a political historian. What I am is a public historian. So what I do here at American University is we work closely with public-facing history institutions. So my students and I work with museums, historical sites, and what we're really interested in is doing history that is engaging and accessible to the public. So we have a lot to learn from artists like Gail, who do such a good job doing this. The other kind of historian that I am is I'm a cultural historian, which is to say that I think about how culture operates as a kind of register in the context of social and political developments, right? So cultural historians like to think that thinking critically about culture is the site at which you reveal certain contradictions in political history and social history. These are always bidirectional and complex. Culture influences as much as it is influenced by historical developments on other registers. The census is very good to think with from a cultural perspective because it reflects cultural categories. So the reason that these change over time is because the way that we think with these categories is also changing. But what the census does, and what many political efforts on behalf of the federal government, including commemoration, do, is they codify them, right? So what the census does every 10 years is it takes these various categories and how people are thinking about identity and makes them visible. And because the census is used in the present moment for political representation, but in future moments by historians, by policy people, by statisticians of all kinds, it really influences in a material, concrete way how it is that we are supposed to think of the categories in our lives. So for that reason, thinking about culture as one register, and politics and social developments as others, and history in its way as its own register, is really interesting to me, and I think this work is really good for doing this. So, using my other hat as a public historian, so I'm an admirer of Gail's work. Also, I grew up here in Washington, D.C. I do a lot of local history, so I've been a kind of long time admirer of the sort of pamphlet-esque work that Gail does, where she overlays what D.C. used to look and feel like and how it looks and feels like now. What she's really good at, what artists are really good at, is engaging viewers, engaging us. you were talking in your own introduction about the difference between visual art and a research paper. What a visual art does is that it gets you on an emotional level. What this art does, which does actually combines not only the sort of, what you typically see in art, but also archival records that are very much used by, the type of people that write research papers. So it combines this kind of, it gives you a lot of stuff to deal with, but it also gives you a lot of information to think with. All of this is true, right? This is, you could turn around and say this to somebody at a dinner party, and this would be factual information. The thing that this art does, and Gail, you said as much, is that it forces you to think about not only the construction of historical categories and how they change over time, but contemporary categories too, right? We're 6 years out from one census, 4 years out from another, and in that time, various identity categories are not static, they're fluid. So what this is useful in thinking about is, what are these going to look like in 10 years, and how does that reflect things that are happening in our present moment? One of the other things that I kind of wanted to say in terms of, so I spent a lot of time the other day kind of standing and looking with these. Something I really love, and I don't know, I'd love to ask you more about this, or perhaps Jack ask you, is the placement. What I love about this being installed around this doorway is that it forces you to go into it, that there's no choice but not to engage. This is true of the census too. There's no option to opt out. It engulfs you in various ways. The thing I like about the images, and again, sort of signature layering of Gail's work, is that they really model the writing and the dissemination of history, where on one hand you can have the archival records that are in the background. So again, you see the raw material, the raw data, what would be, in the footnotes, for example. But in the front, you see kind of what is almost a timeline, which is, for a person who works in a museum, this is one of the kind of key ways that we present historical information for the public because it makes change over time and incredibly visible. So you see this too. The space is also but there's also the space in between, and that's what I really found it. It's an apt illustration for some of the challenges for historians to use as a source, right? That in the same way that this art kind of forces you to think deeply about how these categories are constructed. If you're a historian who works with the census, and nearly every historian does in one way or another, when you're accessing that information, you also need to think about categories. You need to think of how people are classified one way or another. Mexican, for example, only appeared in one census in 1930. You see who is omitted, who is discounted, who is put into certain categories that they may not identify with, and how all of this operates politically, right? How not only does it reflect changes, but how it is used as justification for a new policy, how it is used rhetorically by various politicians, how it becomes the bedrock of, campaign promises, new laws, and initiatives. So that's really all that I had to say. But I'm just really excited to hear more about this, and this is such a rich text to discuss with the audience, so I turn it over back to Bill.
I have one answer to your question about sort of how this show came to be the way it is now. I was approached, and it's really only about 6 months ago. The president of American University asked me, "What are you doing for the 250th birthday party of the United States of America?" And I go, because you don't really run into a whole lot of contemporary art that's about that. Voila! in walks Gail. And then we talked for a while about, where do we do it? And how do we do it? We've worked with windows before. I mean, I got to help facilitate that project in County Town. And so I knew that there are lots of possibilities, with this format. And I think we finally came around to taking advantage of this situation as you walk in, to make it something that everybody sort of sees and deals with first thing.
Yeah, I really like it to be as public art, and it is sort of public art. It's not really in the museum here, and people can see it whenever the building is open, not just during museum hours. And one of the slides in there showed at Riverside, one of my retrospective of Riverside. I did this work after the retrospective here at American University, but they expanded it and included it in Riverside, and they're located on a pedestrian mall, and they have two really big windows, and one piece was printed in each window, and so it really did work as a public art there, and people are attracted to look at it because it looks like it's an American flag, and people think of it as being something patriotic, and then they move in close, and it really forces them to think, and that's what I like about this work. It really asks questions and forces people to think and to make their own kind of connections. It would be great to have questions from the audience.
As society changes almost daily, should there be a census done every 5 years? Technology is coming up 70% a year. But let's get put in jazz.
I mean, you probably have more thoughts about that than I do. I mean, 10 years seems okay to me, to do it every 10 years. I mean, they do interim census, actually. I know there's like a really long form that some people get contacted every 5 years, I think. So the big national census is every 10 years, but they do some interim ones as well.
Yeah, isn't the 10-year requirement in the United States Constitution? Yeah, because it has it's supposed to have the redistricting impact, and that was right from the get-go. You're not supposed to be redistricting necessarily at the time. It's supposed to be based on the census every 10 years. So this is so current, it's scary. And yeah, I didn't realize you had done it before, but it was perfect. So yeah, because the other one also, I think this is the long one also talking about how people live, like how many, do have indoor plumbing, and done, that, done that.
Right here. You have to bring it closer to your mouth. Yeah.
Can you hear me? So I used to work for the Census Bureau. I retired 10 years ago or something. The long form
Right there.
that you're talking about, that the long form was changed to the American Community Survey. And in the American Community Survey, about 60,000 households a month get the questionnaires are mailed out to them. And then another 60,000, another 60,000. And you can combine that data. 5 years worth of data is stable enough to produce estimates. And so what that means is instead of the long form every 10 years, by the time you get to the 1990 census, by the time you get to 1997, it's all outdated. But you would have 5 years, you start 1990 to 95, 91 to 96, 92 to 97, and so the data would be more current. And that's kind of the thinking about the questions and the long form. These questions here, I was interested to see, these are all handwritten form, handwritten, hand supplies. These were done by census enumerators, when the enumerators knocked on the doors. There were no census questions, particularly. I mean, there was a question, but it didn't get read to a respondent. Some of these things were filled out by observation of the enumerator. And they did research in 1960, I think, on the accuracy of the data, the variability of the data, and they found that it was much better, got more standard data, if there were actual questions and the interviewers read the questions to the respondents. So they all got the same question, which wasn't the case before 1960, I think is when we switched. So that's another thing that I don't know if it reflects values, but it certainly affects the quality of it.
I'm also for former Census Bureau. And the issue that was coming up for us was, people weren't trusting government much anyway. And then when Elon Musk's crew basically violated all the confidentiality that was required in the census and started using it for immigration stuff. In terms of quality of data, I don't know how many people are actually going to fill it out anymore. Because most people don't trust, especially the 40% don't trust government period. And now the other side is afraid that the data will be used again. So it's a very precarious time for the census Bureau.
I think wasn't the original purpose really all about creating districts, for representation for the elections? That it has a very specific political purpose.
I mean, yeah, listening to everyone's perspectives and experiences, it makes me think about the difference between purpose on one hand and use on the other, right? That for the people, for the founders who developed this idea of the census, it would be strictly utilitarian, just to go around and figure out who people are so we can have a direct representative government. But as the United States is diversified, as the purpose of government itself has expanded, right? So during the first, century or so of the existence of the United States, people had very little direct contact with the government and very little direct kind of need for the government, right? It's not something that they looked to for assistance. It wasn't and the way that the government worked is that legislation wasn't necessary. Legislation, we didn't have welfare. We didn't have social services. We didn't have kind of public health. We didn't have urban services. All this stuff that census data is critical for now. For building cities, for keeping people safe, for making sure that Americans have access to, their services and needs. That wasn't there anymore. So a lot of what's happened with the census is that it's become kind of more useful and more complex as the role of the government in everyday life, and that includes surveillance, has become more detailed, right? In the present day, probably somebody has keeping tabs on you one way or another every second of the day. You don't necessarily need the census every 10 years to find that out. They have information about you if you use the internet, like if you have a banking account, all of these different things. So a lot of the way that the uses of the census has changed has to do with this kind of expansion on one hand of public services, but also kind of the expansion of demographics and the use of
demographic surveys for commercial purposes. So all of these things, have been kind of looming bigger and bigger and bigger. You're absolutely right that the original purpose of the census was simply to count people every 10 years.
And that gets back to the excellent point about how much trust you have, because when banks are keeping track of me, I don't necessarily. There's a difference, there should be a difference between the bank knowing what I do versus government, unfortunately. And in fact, that's the one comment, in fact, about the racism in those 1792 to Civil War. There was, the fact that slaves were 3/5 for the purposes of district was obviously deeply racist in and of itself, but if you have that, then that's why you have to distinguish that. Specifically that slaves were separate as opposed to, I think they did have, it says other free persons. So, yeah, there was a significance to that, because the other free persons would have counted, even if they weren't allowed to vote in a given state, they would have counted towards that district's number of persons, and the slaves were supposed to be divided, as less than a person. So there was, it's reflective of the racism of the rest of the government, but it's not creating the racism in and of itself. And that gets back to that the census was ideally relatively neutral, academic, but now,
I had a question about when there was a transition between what is so-called slave schedules, 1860, 1865, and after the Civil War. And my understanding about the slave schedules is that they were primarily used to determine taxation. But since Africans were considered property and thereby taxable, the slave schedules indicated how much property would be taxed in addition to the land. So to what extent so when does this particular form, when does slave schedules transition to, I guess, a census report? Or is that a completely different kind of way that the U.S. government started to think about human beings?
I don't know when, the slave schedules were completely separate from the census, is my understanding. And I realize that my work is really simplifying everything. And I'm not a census scholar either, obviously. And so what I want my work to do is to raise questions and to make people start to think about these things, like the issue that you just raised. And you bring your knowledge to this as well, since not everybody has knowledge of the slave schedules. But so as much knowledge as you have, that really influences the way that you look at this work and the questions that you raise on it. Like one of the pieces is called something like Sailor, Soldier, Marine, and it lists a whole bunch of wars that I think most people don't even know that the United States was involved in. As if you're asking if you were a veteran of those wars. Or one of the questions shortly after the Civil War asks you if you were a veteran of the USA or CSA. And for most people, it's like, you usually think, what does CSA mean? But obviously, like a historian would look at it immediately. Answer the question.
One question we have is, and we've been talking about it, how this work fits into the current controversies regarding the portrayal of American history.
So, one of the things that Trump has said is that one of the things that Trump has said, and I have a quote I have written down about
I can read it to you.
Yeah, read it.
This was at the White House conference on September 17th. Our mission is to defend the legacy of America's founding, the virtue of America's heroes, and the nobility of the American character. We must clear away the twisted web of lies in our schools and classrooms and teach our children the magnificent truth about our country. We want our sons and daughters to know that they are the citizens of the most exceptional nation in the history of the world.
And that has caused the National Park Service to have to get rid of certain exhibitions that reflect slavery and reflect facts about our history. And then on that same page, I have a quote of Lonnie Bunch about what he, could you read that one in contrast?
This is Lonnie Bunch.
Yes.
Microphone.
Yes. Thank you. The greatest strength of America is the opportunity to look at how we have fought, debated, struggled, and protested in order to make concrete the ideals of the Declaration of Independence.
So what I feel that my work is doing is, obviously I'm picking and choosing, but is showing the actual history, things that actually happened. And I do think that there is a way of actually looking at my work optimistically, that in terms of the way the census has changed and the way the questions have changed. Like one of them is about babies, and one of the questions implies that only married women can have babies. So Obama and people talk about towards a more perfect union, and I think that the census questions are broader and do reflect our history, but sort of warts and all.
I just to kind of emphasize what you're saying. When you mentioned the National Park Service taking down exhibits having to do with enslavement, so the marquee example of this, and this is happening at a lot of sites, but the one that has been most prominent is at the President's house, which is part of it's George Washington's first home as president before the White House was built, at the National Independence State Park in Philadelphia. And something to say about the National Park Service is for the last 10 years they've been doing exceptional work, really researching deeply into an inclusive history of America that accounts for the experiences of so many people. And exhibits like the President's House, so precisely the kinds of exhibits that Trump is reacting to, are the product of that. So you had for several years, or at least a few years, work about the people who George Washington enslaved. And those are the parts that are taken down because people, I guess, did not want to grapple, or the Trump administration did not want people to grapple with the implications of a president who is also an enslaver. And in particular, there's one of the slaves implementing from a judge ran away, and he basically spent the next 20 years trying to find her, and he never got her. There's a really wonderful book about it called Her Cop by the historian Ashley Farmer, but her story was there were a few others too. So that's one of the things that got taken down, and that's something that I was really excited to see. And I was at a conference in Philadelphia in April, and I was at the conference right near the President's house, so I went on 3 separate days. And all 3 of those days, there were people who had been putting up their own signage. So they had been putting up newspaper clippings explaining what had happened. They had documentation of the panels that had been taken down and been taking that down too, where they had been kind of just writing slogans, protect our history, and putting them up, and they're kind of standing around and talking. And that to me was really exciting because it showed that Americans really wanted, this more nuanced, more complex system for exactly the reasons that people like Europe much says, or I guess in effect very much says. But one of the things that I think that I really liked is that people had the evidence, including, one of the things that, did it break? One of the things that I think Gail's work shows really well is that all this stuff is available for you and for
come and find and to work with and read. You know, we all have access to all of these census records, and if you have questions based on what you're seeing here, you can actually go look at it yourself. So one of the questions I actually really wanted to ask you, and this is a random question, is what was it like engaging with these records? How did you go and look at them in person? Did you do them online? Can you talk more about the kind of archival research part of all of this? Because I've really been interested.
They're all online, and I looked at them all online. I did not look at the original ones, but they have all the questions are online, and it was interesting because from the census said that there were not specific questions. The way they are online is that there are these specific questions. So I took everything verbatim, and you can actually see the original census forms, that those are online as well. The ones that I used as background, I decided to use all ones from DC, but they would look similar all across the country. One question sometimes people ask me is, what gave me the idea to do this? And it's because I've been using these census forms for my work in terms of the work that's cultural history of specific sites, and I've also done a lot of work that's about genealogy, and the census forms are used for that. And I was just really struck by how the questions change over time. I also have a piece that's called Manifest that is about immigration to the United States and the records that were kept when ships come in. Those questions have really changed over time too dramatically. Like there was one period of time where they asked you if you're an anarchist. And early on, there was absolutely no record. People just, the country just wanted people to come in, and there was no record. It was just the number of people on the ship, that's all. So it's really fascinating to me how this changes and what that means.
As these questions change, how do historians and or maybe the public, how is it possible to speak about trends when the trade-off on surveying is always consistency versus modernizing, it seems to me, in the work that I've done, which was all about health insurance. And the questions here the answers here don't really change. Your race doesn't change, your gender can't change, but only recently, I guess. But with health insurance, it's a point in time. But what I'm getting at is a lot of newspapers, I think, publish material about how we trends. But it would seem like even just the point you made about the first time that you can now check more than one racial box. So how are historians going to say anything about racial composition and trends?
I think the questions that historians ask change along with, you would ask a different set of questions from the 1920s census as you would from the 1950 census, as you will from the 2030 census. And the census, it's worth saying, for historians are always one small part of a larger body of evidence. So the eyes and the perspective that you bring to the census is already informed by kind of these trends as you're talking about, right? So you're looking at the census as one piece of evidence of a larger, more complex historical moment. So, now we are thinking a lot about sort of multiracial identification, and the census will bear that out. And, those are the kinds of questions that the historians of the future are going to be asking and answering.
I guess immigration status.
Yeah, that too. I mean, the census is as much documentation as it is itself a symptom of, its own larger context, right? And so you think about it that way too. That it's never, even though it's a kind of demographic survey and it's supposed to be, as neutral and empirical as possible. It's actually not empirical at all, as are not most pieces of evidence. So I think that's the attitude that we bring to them.
To what extent is the sense of it trustworthy and useful? Since it seems it will become a tool of, in some sense, political assessment, subject to ideologies, and just the political bias of maybe even the analysts. Has it gotten better over the years, or is it better to just try and trace the steps and just like someone said, just can people for the purpose of distributing resources and providing support for those who need it?
Well, I mean, to me, one of the points of this work is to ask questions about the census as well, and to, I'm not going to say the word correctly. It's an issue. It's a question. How reliable is the census? Because we think of this as being a neutral document, as being factual, and so I want this work to raise questions not only about how the questions have changed, but how much we should rely on this, because obviously the way you ask a question is going to determine the answer to the question, and then people become afraid as well of if they should answer it at all. And I know that was an issue in the 2020 census, that a lot of people did not want to answer it, especially people who are immigrants or who are considered undocumented who are in this country were afraid to answer the census. And the whole thing about is their privacy going to be respected or not? So it is a big issue.
You said it. I would say the same thing.
Do you have any suggestions how you can restore confidence?
Well, there are elections.
With art like this, I guess restore perspective as much as restore confidence. Everything needs to be understood in its own kind of larger context. And I think art like this makes you, even in a perfect world where, the census is perfectly restored and everyone believes that it is still going to be biased. It is still always going to be biased, no matter what. But work like this teaches us to at least start to think about where those biases are. Nothing's neutral. Nothing objectivity is a lie. Like I'm telling you this as a historian.
Yeah, certainly not the museum.
Right.
Well, although I think some people are trying a little more than others to be. I think Gail is trying to raise consciousness and isn't trying to slant the perspective. I think that's not necessarily always the case by that statement about how we're the most exceptional country ever on the planet. Is a little different. Objective.
I'm trying to raise questions. There's no data, and usually people use the census form to analyze the data, and I'm not analyzing the data at all. It's just I'm trying to raise questions.
You're not trying to make us more woke, are you?
I'm trying to make people think. It's really.
Well, see, that's a political statement. Are there any other questions? Be careful.
Well, I hope everybody will do the QR code and add whatever questions you think would be appropriate for the census. That would be very interesting to see.
Where are you going to send them?
Yeah, I was wondering, since we have some census experts here, how did the U.S. Census compare with some other developed nations in terms of, the protocol of it?
It's actually interesting in Rwanda, which had the ethnic genocide, the Tutsi versus the and part of the settlement from that was they now refuse to ask ethnic identity at all because they're afraid it'll be used for something. And it's made it really tough for them to do things like try to figure out how many people died and stuff because you're not allowed to say who you are. But I think every country tries to do a decennial. India just went through, God, it was multiple months, I think. China's probably, they just photograph you and you're done. Yeah, every country that I know of has to do something roughly every 10 years.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Gail, and MJ, thank you.